Hello, everyone. Welcome. Please take your seats. Greetings. My name is Chris Cervanek. I am the Associate Director at the Center for Civil and Human Rights. Thank you very much for deciding to spend your lunchtime with us. And I want to thank the Liu Institute for Asian Studies, who is co-sponsoring all of Sister Angela's visit over the next couple days here at Notre Dame. I want to thank in particular Patrick Deegan and Kevin Fye, without whom this visit would not be possible. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Sister Angela Reed. We met in May around the United Nations. I was in New York and I got to meet her, and I'd been hearing about her and I'd read her thesis and became convinced that she had to come to Notre Dame and share her knowledge and experience with us. So Sister Angela is a Catholic sister. She's a sister of mercy. You'll hear her wonderful accent. She's from Australia. And for many years, she was the manager of her congregation's safe house for women and children in Melbourne. She's also an activist. She's committed to advancing human rights for all and is particularly focused on the elimination of violence against women and human trafficking. She's currently acting coordinator of Mercy Global Action at the United Nations, which is her congregation's representative organization to the UN with special consultative status. And her Sisters of Mercy work in 47 countries, and at the UN they give voice to their experience and the voice of the grassroots that they engage. They bring that to the UN table. I followed her interventions with video and audio over the last year at various United Nations meetings, and I have to say she's calling for radical shifts in countries' approaches to human trafficking worldwide, and does it in a very articulate way. She's a scholar, which is of... If anyone would like to see her thesis, we're going to have it online at our center's website. She's educated in theology, counseling, social work, business governance, and has a PhD from the School of Global, Urban, and Social Studies at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. So this thesis is entitled Exploiting Vulnerability, a study of the lives of Filipino women who have been trafficked into sex work. And her scholarship subverts stereotypes of homogenous sex trafficking experiences and proposes a path forward in responding to the voices of victims themselves. We'll hear about her work and research today in her talk, Reframing Human Trafficking, a Human Rights Life Course Approach. I also want to let you all know that at 3:30 today, so we'll have this time together. We will definitely, those who need to leave at 1:30, I know some of you need to get to class, feel free to leave quietly, but we will be here in conversation until 1:45. But at 3:30 in the Hesburgh Auditorium in the Hesburgh Center just down the street, there'll be more of an informal conversation with Sister Angela that's sponsored by the Liu Institute. And so if any of you would like to really continue to engage her today, you're welcome to come to the 3:30 event at the Hesburgh Auditorium. So please join me in welcoming Sister Angela Reed.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that lovely introduction, and I'd like to especially thank the Centre for Civil and Human Rights and the Liu Institute for sponsoring this visit to Notre Dame. I keep calling it Notre Dame, and I've got to get it right. It's Notre Dame. So it's really lovely to be here. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share my research with you, and I'd like to focus specifically today on challenging the dominant discourse on human trafficking and reframing it within a gendered human rights life course context. This largely, as Chris says, reflects the participatory research that I've undertaken with women in the Philippines who were trafficked as teenagers, and my work with marginalised women in Australia whose life trajectories reflect stigmatisation, abuse and vulnerability. I'm going to have to move fairly quickly through the presentation. It's quite dense and there's quite a bit, so at times I might quickly skip a slide to see, and I'll see how your energy levels are going. I hope you can understand my accent. Someone said when I first arrived in America 14 months ago, I didn't understand you for the first day that I was talking to you. So hopefully you'll understand me. So I've structured the presentation into 5 parts. First, I'd like to present to you the dominant trafficking paradigms. And have you reflect upon your own perceptions and understandings of human trafficking? Second, I want to introduce my research and the notion of vulnerabilities to human trafficking, and most importantly, understanding these through a life cause lens. Thirdly, I want to introduce you to a preventative framework for anti-trafficking in which I've devised 17 optimal life course conditions. I call them OLCCs. I will outline some of the human rights violations across the life course, and I'm sure that as students and scholars of law, many of you will be able to pick up the human rights violations before I even name them. And I will refer to some of the international law treaties and conventions that address such violations. And finally, I'll discuss the significance of my research and how it contributes to policy development and focus. So first, I want to introduce you in part one to Professor Carol Barchi, who talks about problematisation, a huge word, but in actual fact, a simple word. How do we think about problems? So Carol Barchi provides a very useful set of questions for studying social problems. She speaks of problematisation, arguing that all public policies, so this is regardless of trafficking, all public policies have ethical implications. And she states that public policies are often representations or constructions of social problems. Barchi adopts what she calls a WPR approach. What's the problem represented to be? And in taking this approach, she seeks to surface often concealed aspects of an issue. She argues that how we present or frame problems determines the way in which we see we can solve them. So in applying her WPR approach, Barchi asks 5 key questions. First, she says we need to interrogate our own assumptions about social issues. And here we must ask ourselves, what's assumed or what is taken for granted when thinking about this social problem? What's not questioned? And in doing this, we uncover the assumed thought that lies behind specific problem representations. The discourse or the language we use to describe certain problems encompasses our own assumptions and values, and invariably binaries simplify complex relationships. And so as I'm talking about human trafficking today, you might become more aware of these binaries or attempts to simplify complex relationships. Barchi says, what are the taken for granted givens? And the purpose of this question is to highlight the conditions that allow a particular problem representation to take shape and to assume dominance. And then Barchi says we need to shift from problem solving, I found this really helpful, from problem solving to problem questioning. She asks, what fails to be problematised? Who fails to be heard? And then she says, does the way that a problem is presented, for example, this image, does it seek to benefit or harm some members of the community? In some policy decisions, social interventions can have devastating effects for certain people. It can lead to the objectification of people as problems. It affects access to resources. What is likely to change through this representation of the problem, and what's likely to stay the same? And critically, she asks, who's likely to be blamed for this problem? And finally, she says, what is the means through which the problem representation becomes dominant? Maybe through the media, maybe through politicians, maybe through social settings, academic settings, churches. How do the representation of problems achieve their legitimacy? And the key question for me is, how do I get the information I need to really analyse and understand a social issue, a problem, or a policy position. So, as advocates and people of social justice, and as no doubt critical thinkers, we must ensure that we simply don't buy into certain problem representations, but to question the dominant ways in which an issue has been represented. So today, my challenge is to ask you to critically think about the issue of human trafficking, to look at how it's been problematised, to question the dominant ways in which it's been represented. So first, I'm not going to assume that you know the Palermo definition or the international definition of human trafficking. You may or you may not, depending on what kind of studies you've done. But this is the international definition on trafficking, which can be found in the UN Convention on Transnational and Organised Crime. Within this convention, the optional protocol on trafficking is housed, and that's it there. It's often referred to as the Palermo Protocol. I don't expect you to read it in its entirety, and I know there's a lot of words on the page there, but you might want to note down that that's where the legal international definition of trafficking is housed. And there are three elements to that definition. We can break it down this way. We can say there's the process or the act, what's done, the means, how it is done, and the purpose, for what reason. And if you look at all those, you can see that trafficking can take many forms. Labour trafficking, for example, like in sweatshop labour, agricultural industry, in fishing industry, organ transplants. There are all forms of trafficking, domestic labour. Some would also say through forced marriage. My particular area that I was studying was trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation. So in my research, I argue that human trafficking, particularly in relation to trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation, has been sensationalised, resulting in a plethora of media stories and images, such as this one, where accounts of kidnapping, rape and incarceration dominate. Such stories can evoke shock, horror, anger and sorrow at the pitiful plight of the women. Feelings of revulsion towards the captors whose cruel and inhumane treatment is almost beyond belief create a distance between the listener and the one victimised. The problem with such an overrepresentation of these sensationalised accounts is that the depth and complexity of the experience can be overlooked. So I do not want you to think that I'm discounting in any way the horrendous nature of human trafficking, but a heightened focus on random acts of sexual violence rather than the life trajectory of the person will lose the important aspect of trafficking. It will result in narrow and essentialist ideas of what it means to be a victim of trafficking for sexual exploitation. Other stories of trafficking for sexual exploitation that are not heard or attract little attention in public discourse do not necessarily have the same impact as sensationalised accounts. These stories tell us that sex trafficking can occur in less overt ways, whereby a woman becomes a victim of sexual exploitation throughout her life course. That is, through a more systemic process of victimisation than the sensationalists can allow. Not only do these stories need to be heard, they need to be recognised as providing valid knowledge, enabling a more comprehensive understanding of trafficking for sexual exploitation to emerge and to give shape to local and global policy and service responses to human trafficking. Can everybody hear me clearly? I'm not talking too fast. Put your hand up if you need to and tell me to slow down. So how has human trafficking been problematised? In my reading of the literature over the last 6-7 years, and considering the dominant discourse, I've identified what I describe as 7 trafficking paradigms, or lenses, if you like, through which the issue is viewed. And so I'll briefly describe these to you. The first one is globalisation. And I'm going to go fairly quickly through these paradigms, but if you want to, like Chris said, you can get a copy of my thesis where I talk in more detail about these paradigms. So the globalisation paradigm emphasises the notion of invisible borders whereby not only products and information are moving across borders at a rapid pace, but also people. And hence the commodification of people across state borders and international borders. The relevant literature regarding globalisation and sex trafficking confirms that a neoliberal global economy has benefited wealthy nations and marginalised those from the global south, particularly women. And as a result, this global environment is highly conducive to trafficking for sexual exploitation. There are others who say it's all about economics, and they say fundamentally it's about financial profit, with the illegal sex industry understood to be the 3rd fastest growing economic enterprise in the world. So, primarily related to a neoliberal economic framework, this paradigm situates global markets as the causal link with the interaction of supply and demand at the heart of the sex trafficking phenomenon. Those who claim that sex trafficking is largely an issue of economics argue that the demand for cheap sex from relatively wealthy customers is complemented by the supply of impoverished women and children who seek to improve their financial plight. And I want to read you just a quick quote from Louise Brown, who was the author of Sex Slaves. She says, "Let's make no mistake, prostitution is not just about poverty. The sex industry makes money because it buys cheap, raw materials and packages them well. It turns vulnerability into a commodity and that commodity into a profit." She's talking about a human being there being commodified. Then there are those who say it's all about migration. The migration paradigm has an inherent link between human trafficking and women's migration. Framed within the context of livelihood and women in less developed countries, this paradigm acknowledges women's changing role in the workforce and the advantages and disadvantages. So exponents of this paradigm argue that to work towards the elimination of sex trafficking, we must look at the migration patterns of women and the root causes of their movement. Others argue women should have the right to freely move about for work and not be constrained by policy decisions that say about border control for the protection of women. And then one that you'd be fairly, I hope, aware of would be the human rights paradigm. And this situates the exploited person at the centre of any discussion on human trafficking. Considered to be human-centric, its focus is on the rights and protections of the trafficked person. So this paradigm makes a direct link between the root causes of trafficking, arguing for preventative practices that improve the socio-economic standards of those considered vulnerable to trafficking. So proponents of this paradigm call on human rights mechanisms, such as conventions like CEDAW and the UN Trafficking Protocol. Then there are those who say it's all about gender. The gender paradigm situates gender-based subordination, discrimination and violence as causally linked to trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation. So despite efforts at both national and international levels, the inferior status of women and girls is still considered to be an issue across the globe. The issue of sexual violence and prostitution are by far the most controversial within this paradigm, and they form the basis of a robust body of literature with passionate arguments on all sides of the political divide. So proponents of the gender paradigm believe that addressing systemic injustices against women will work towards eliminating sex trafficking. And then there is the organised crime and corruption paradigm. This paradigm is probably the most dominant paradigm. Situated in local, national and international contexts, organised crime is seen as a fundamental cause of sex trafficking by those who subscribe to the criminal paradigm. So in relation to trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation, organised crime networks operate at different levels. Significantly, as I showed you earlier, the United Nations Protocol Against Human Trafficking actually accompanies the Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime. So it sits within the criminal domain. And then there is the local paradigm, which is totally the opposite to the globalised paradigm. And the local paradigm makes an argument for recognising the unique places and unique experiences of sex trafficking, saying that it's situational. So whilst the global paradigm refers to labour exploitation and free trade and sex tourism, the localised paradigm focuses more on cultural, social and economic environmental factors which influence sex trafficking. For example, in the Philippines, one of the influences, local influences, is the American military bases, is said to contribute to prostitution and therefore sex trafficking, as well as the notion of colonisation, which is also not only unique to the Philippines. So this multi-paradigm approach, which I've just flown through, offers a more nuanced approach than do simple dichotomies often expressed in grand, sensationalist narratives that dominate the discourse on sex trafficking. However, missing from those paradigms are the women's voices, are those who have experienced trafficking firsthand. And feminist scholars argue that we must hear from them in order to be more informed. And so often, as I said, a response to trafficking has been to put up state-controlled borders rather than look at it from a human rights issue. And with the focus on the nation-state, trafficked persons have been considered illegal immigrants. This table here is the work of Jennifer Lobas, an activist, a feminist, who puts the policy focus clearly within what she calls a feminist framework. And you'll see there, in a traditional approach to trafficking, the security referent is the state, the nation state, but in a human rights approach, it's people. My research, which began in 2011, contributes to a growing but still relatively new body of work involving qualitative research about women's experiences of being trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. The importance of hearing the voices of young women who had experienced human trafficking became a reality for me in 2008 when I first encountered and engaged with Filipino women who had been trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation into Cebu City in the Philippines. Their stories revealed a lifetime of gender depression and marginalisation that included family violence, economic deprivation, educational limitations, and the influence on them of class, culture, and socio-economic status. When I first heard these women's stories and saw their plight, I was stirred to action. Because if we fail to hear their accounts of systemic abuse which begins in childhood and blights their life trajectories and do not appreciate the importance of their insights into the nature of trafficking for sexual exploitation, then we will fail them miserably. During my first visit to the Philippines, the personal indeed became political. My desire to have these women's voices heard became an ethical imperative. Adopting a constructionist and a feminist epistemology and methodology in my research, I argue that women's knowledge and experience must be at the centre of any discussion on human trafficking for the purpose of exploitation, of sexual exploitation. So what I'm going to do now is allow you to read the 4 research questions that I sought to have answered in my research. Here's the first one. And if you think back to the paradigms, you might be able to see why I asked such questions. In a sense, the paradigms reflect what we already know. And I'm saying a constructionist epistemology, I'm saying the women are going to add knowledge to an already growing knowledge about trafficking. And finally, I wanted to know how could what women have to say about their experiences inform policy on human trafficking. So in giving voice to women and in understanding sex trafficking from their perspective, I propose an 8th paradigm, which I call the life course paradigm. This paradigm allows for a more nuanced understanding of the sex trafficking trajectory. I should say the vulnerability to sex trafficking. It entails an exploration of women's narratives about personal circumstances in childhood, through adolescence and into adulthood, combined with the factors that exist in the external environment. So I contend that the interplay between the personal life story and environmental and systemic factors render one vulnerable to human trafficking. In other words, being a victim of human trafficking is not an accident. It's a sinister process of victimisation. In listening to the women's stories of childhood, I was overwhelmed by the deprivation, marginalisation and abuse that they had experienced. I had anticipated that their stories of being trafficked for sex would be traumatic, but nothing could have prepared me for the shock and anger I felt when I heard their childhood stories. And I didn't ask them to tell me their childhood stories. I asked them to tell me their trafficking stories, and they chose to begin telling me about their childhood, which automatically said that they're saying there's a link between my early childhood and my trafficking experience. And in contrast, these stories highlighted my own privileged background in which I experienced childhood as a time of opportunity to grow and develop through experiences of safe, secure family schooling and community connectedness. In contrast, these women's experiences were unsafe. They had neglected and marginalised childhoods with systemic abuse and deprivation, leading to their vulnerability to sex trafficking. So Teresita said to me, you know, I really didn't experience any joyful memories. From 0 to 16, during those years, I can't recall any happy memories because when I play, my mother always beat me up. Everywhere on my body, sometimes it's my head, so I don't have good memories. Maybe now I have, but before I had none. 2/3 of the women interviewed revealed that they had been sexually abused in childhood. Now, as an ethical researcher, I would never ask them if that happened. 2/3 of the women revealed to me voluntarily that they were sexually abused in childhood. They wanted me to make the connection between human trafficking and childhood. Some of them as young as 3 years old. And I know this is very difficult to listen to. You know, it's very distressing. Sexual abuse was perpetrated by male family members, in particular by fathers, brothers and uncles, and in some instances by neighbours and in the community. The women never spoke of random acts of sexual abuse by strangers, but always within the context of family or a close-knit community. Many describe the experience of sexual abuse as resulting in them feeling fearful, shamed, betrayed, powerless, depressed, anxious, and confused about their sexuality. All of this occurred prior to a trafficking event. Some described themselves as silent and unable to function, yet others described defiance, anger, and rage. This experience of sexual abuse represented a turning point in these women's lives, and they expressed emotional reactions that are commonly experienced by children who've been sexually abused. Alita said, "After that rape, I cannot look that man in the eye. I felt so ashamed. I felt ashamed because I did not do something when he raped me. I did not even shout for help." As I listened to the women's stories from childhood through adolescence and into early adulthood, I was deeply moved. How could I not be? When I asked about the impact of poverty, one of the women challenged me and she said, "You know, there are many, many women in the Philippines who live in poverty, but not all of them are trafficked." This challenged me to think critically about the intersectional nature of their marginalisation. Not only did they experience poverty, but also discrimination on account of their gender, stigmatisation on account of their status. And I was forced to look much more deeply and to examine the root causes of the vulnerability to trafficking. Cumulative disadvantage over the life course was emerging as a strong theme in my research. I began to see that their life journeys resembled that of a roller coaster, moving from one crisis to another. Here's a diagram that I put together about the childhood experience. So when people said to me, "Oh, you're doing a whole PhD on trafficking, isn't it just about poverty?" Here's the themes I came up with. Oh, hang on a minute. Don't tell me it's not going to do it. Okay, I'll have to read them to you. So those spokes normally will come up with a bubble, and it will have abuse, and then outside of that abuse it has sexual abuse, verbal abuse, financial abuse, emotional abuse. Then there's another one, environment, violence, rural isolation, lack of education, relationships, abandoned, because that in their experience many of them had a parent working away from them, or one or two parents. So this whole graphic is very revealing in that it shows the complexity of the trafficking vulnerabilities. It's not just about poverty. Jovi said, "There was an instance that I ran away from home and I went to another place and I found one man there who always stalked me and he touched my body. So I found places where there were plenty of people. I was so fearful at that time." And then, unfortunately, this graphic isn't working either, I don't think. No. So this graphic almost repeats that childhood graphic, but it brings in deception, captivity, isolation, objectification. When you put the two graphs, overlap the two graphs together, you get a sense of the complexity of vulnerabilities to trafficking. So ongoing sexual victimisation was a strong theme in the women's narratives. They illuminate the trafficking experiences as isolating, degrading, controlling, and imposing on their personal freedom. Stripped of their true identity and stigmatised by the society, they were considered by many to be the least acceptable, and some of them considered themselves worthless and no longer of any value to society. Loss of identity was experienced through objectification, drug inducement, being viewed as an economic transaction, and their stigmatisation. They experienced feelings of fear, shame, despair, shock, sadness, and in some instances, self-blame. Significantly, these were also feelings that many experienced in childhood, indicating a life course of marginalisation on account of their class, gender and stigmatisation among the lowest in the social order. So what new insights, what do we learn? What can I learn from what these women told me? Well, these women's accounts cast new ideas about trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, adding a unique thread to our understanding of the phenomenon that is all too common. Their accounts unveil the reality of the trafficking experience in a way that no theoretical analysis can do. In their accounts, which indicate multiple oppressions, including gender discrimination, poverty, rural isolation, limited educational opportunities and family disintegration, the women themselves challenge the view that being trafficked for sexual exploitation is a one-off event in a woman's life and draw attention to human rights violations and systemic oppression across the life trajectory. The women's narratives revealed that in the Philippines, and it's not just the Philippines, this is phenomenological research, so we know that it can be elsewhere. We know that aspects of it can be universalised. The women's narratives reveal that in the Philippines, the market for cheap sex is an exploitative one, preying on vulnerable young women, largely constructed out of male sexual privilege and dominance. It exploits young and disadvantaged women and reaps large profits for those who invest in the industry. It is clear that the women who participated in this research were born into and lived in poverty and were unwitting victims of globalisation. Most of them also experienced family violence and sexual abuse, as I've already said, and some of them from a very early age. Many had migrated, so can you hear the paradigms? Many had migrated in order to flee impoverishment and oppression and to seek new alternatives for their future. Some were victims of petty criminals, themselves caught up on the bottom rungs of national and global crime networks. They all were born into a culture that has oppressed women, imposed on them a double standard of morality, used them for pleasure and condemned them for failing to match up to the idealised perfect woman, Madonna archetype. Their basic human rights were denied at every level of their existence. And therefore, I assert that sex trafficking occurs with the confluence of factors where global and local forces intersect with individual vulnerability. Women's accounts of being trafficked for sexual exploitation give credence to and further expand on the dominant human trafficking paradigms. In terms of the global and economic paradigms, women's narratives affirm the dire circumstances of poverty that many Filipino families faced, particularly those in rural areas. Their narratives also confirm that opportunities for work in the local environment were rare and that provision of adequate food and clothing was difficult in light of the fact that many families were struggling to maintain a basic livelihood. Lack of government and social and economic infrastructure, particularly in rural areas, was highlighted, indicating that the burden of national debt that served to curtail government infrastructure investment was taking its toll on the people. Regarding the human rights paradigm, despite their experiences of abuse, many women upheld their dignity through a belief in their own self-worth and a right to self-determination. They acknowledged their claim to basic human rights and expressed a strong desire to live a life free from violence and commodification. Women also frequently maintained a sense of hope that someday they would be freed from brutal exploitation. In a very restrictive and violent environment, they exhibited extraordinary human resilience and hope that enabled them to survive their ordeals, and in this sense they practised agency. So I want to talk now about prevention as key. As I indicated earlier, human trafficking has been framed in a number of ways. A predominant focus has been criminal justice approach, and that's important, whereby the focus has been on criminalisation, prosecution and state security. This approach has meant that whilst there have... I'm just having difficulty reading my own writing. This approach has meant that whilst there have been few prosecutions, many resources have been invested in law enforcement and border protection. And while this is an important response to trafficking, life course narratives of formerly trafficked women build a strong case for a need to focus on prevention. I'm going to have to put my glasses on. I was avoiding doing that because if I look up I can't see, but I'll have to do it. And so the women's stories illustrate that there is a strong need to focus on prevention and for resources to be allocated in that way. Their accounts highlight the need, give voice to the need for intervention and preventative measures early in the life course, challenging life trajectories of cumulative disadvantage culminating in the trafficking experience. In the Philippines and in many other states, prevention has been largely focused on community education and anti-trafficking training, which, whilst effective, does not address trafficking vulnerabilities over the life course. And so I've designed, in response to these narratives, and through my research and building on my academic and global policy work, I have identified and developed a preventative framework consisting of 17 optimal life course conditions. I refer to them as the OLCCs. These conditions are a set of circumstances that, when integrated, are intended to counter vulnerabilities to trafficking. Grounded in a multidisciplinary approach, these conditions are founded on the premise that vulnerability to trafficking will be significantly reduced if all OLCCs are enabled. And yes, it's idealistic, but it's actually a fulfilment of their human rights. Considered a long-term trafficking prevention mechanism, these conditions seek to realise the human dignity of all and draw upon the most fundamental human rights reflected in human rights treaties and protocols. Understood from a life course perspective, the OLCCs seek to influence both the personal circumstances of the individual and the social, cultural and economic and political environment in which one is situated. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of those conditions. In childhood, you'll see that I've named 6, and those 6 conditions speak directly to the experience that they shared with me. So these are conditions that I'm saying counter the vulnerabilities. Childhood should be one of the most cherished stages of a person's life, one in which a child's growth and development should be nurtured. So the circumstances, memories and events that formerly trafficked women recall creates a picture of exactly the opposite of what I've just described. Child psychologists tell us that the developmental nature of childhood has implications for later victimisation. They claim that childhood is a period of enormous change in size, strength, cognitive capacities, gender differentiation, relationships and social environments, all of which affect the potential for victimisation. And so ensuring conditions of health and well-being in relation to childhood must be underpinned for the right for children to flourish. So the following 6 address these potential vulnerabilities. If we look at the first one, an adequate standard of living. One of the things, that Kathy told me was she said, when I was a teenager, I left school because I told my grandmother that I would help earn money, and so I started working as a waitress. So what do we know about human rights? We know that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that all should have the right to an adequate standard of living. We know that the International Convention on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights clearly outlines the right to an adequate standard of living. We can call on all of these conventions to prevent human trafficking. We know that the Convention on the Rights of a Child has many aspects that talk about the right to an adequate standard of living. And so what I've tried to do is, through the research, look at what aspects from sociology and psychology and now human rights law can be integrated to ensure a multidisciplinary preventative approach. Kathy also said, when I was 13, I attended my mother's funeral. I was told that she was pregnant at the time and had been beaten up by her living partner. She had many bruises all over her body. It was very scary to see her that way. And again, we know the right to be free from violence. We find that in the Conventions on the Rights of the Child and others, and also the Commissioner's recommended principles and guidelines on the Declaration of Elimination of Violence Against Women. These are all tools that help us in this preventative model. Kathy said, I attended school up until my second year of high school. My grandmother was the one who bore the cost of my schooling, though sometimes my father would give her money. When I was a teenager, I left school because I had told my grandma that I would help earn money. Well, we've got that part. So we look at the rights to education. They're all there. I don't need to give them to you. You know probably where to find them better than I do. And then I've named in adolescence another 5 life course conditions, optimal life course conditions. For many, the ongoing nature of the abuse meant that it was an accepted part of their reality. I'm conscious of time and people that need to go. I'm not going to read any of this, but these rights, the rights of children to protection, all of these human rights are helpful tools. I'll just read you this one about Kathy's experience of trafficking. She says, for 3 weeks, I was just dancing on the stage, and then one night I was told that somebody had bar-fined me. I did not know what this meant. A more experienced woman explained that a man had bought me. I could not escape because there were people who watched what we were doing. We called them watchers. And so she has the right to psychosexual health and development, to long-term freedom from violence. And again, these are all in the conventions. I'm going to fly through them. You can just see them as I go. A lot of people just turn to the Palermo Protocol in response to, but we've got all these other conventions that can help us and build on it, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that have just been adopted by the United Nations for the next 15 years. And people are just picking one, which is on gendered violence. We need to look at all the goals in the context of trafficking. And then the last 6 in adulthood, in order to be less vulnerable to trafficking, are those optimal life course conditions. And you'll see, again, calling on different conventions there. I always prepare way too much, but it's there. Okay, I'm just going to go through that bit there. I think just to say now that To conclude today, I have sought to illustrate the importance of qualitative research that seeks to gain knowledge of trafficking from those who have experienced it firsthand, allowing for more nuanced accounts. I argued that the dominant discourses about human trafficking have been sensationalist and that human trafficking has been largely presented as a random act of victimisation. There is a need for a much more nuanced understanding as a result of cumulative disadvantage and victimisation over the life course. And this preventative model is one way of approaching the issue of trafficking. Women's voices have contributed to the knowledge gap. Key to a transformative, critical feminist framework is the notion that feminist research contributes to the liberation and transformation of marginalised and oppressed women. Research from this perspective becomes an instrument for improving women's daily lives and influencing public policies and opinion. This interdisciplinary research is an instrument of such transformation, speaking directly to oppressive structures and ideologies, including economic, cultural, social and political oppressions. Prevention is key to an anti-trafficking measure. The optimal life course conditions act as a preventative model. The OLCCs are designed to counter vulnerabilities to trafficking and are in direct response to women's narratives of victimisation, oppression and marginalisation. Excuse me. Significantly, there is no quick fix or grand solution for eliminating the exploitation and commodification of people. And unfortunately, there are people who think there is a quick fix. The optimal life course conditions provide a long-term, interdisciplinary trafficking prevention framework. These conditions encapsulate the values for life as articulated by those who have personally experienced trafficking and reflect an integrated life course, human rights and gender-sensitive response. The time for action is now, and women's accounts call for a focused preventative approach in order for them to fully realise their human rights. Thank you very much. I'm conscious that some of you need to leave because I know you've got classes, but we do have some time for questions. And so you might want to just take a minute or two to think about if there's a question you want to ask or expand on. I hopefully can answer it. Thank you.
A lot of cultures themselves denigrate women. I mean, that's no new.
Mm-hmm.
And they do it in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So when women are coming from cultures that time of birth, they're already denigrated and considered second rate, well, of course it's going to be easy for criminal gangs or criminal outfits or their own relatives in some way exploit them. And so it takes, what you're saying there, but it takes a lot more than that. You're going to have to actually start with changing these cultures from their very norms. It's quite all right to exploit women. It's quite all right. No, we're not going to give them an education. Look at it in the 21st century here, the 21st century. How many cultures around the world in this planet, when young girls are not allowed to go to school or walking around with veils and over their head and things, just any little ways to denigrate women. There's a million ways that they use to denigrate young women.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's universal. You're right. I mean, it's not unique to one particular culture. But that's one of the reasons that in the optimal life course conditions, in the very first 5, there is gender equality. And I mean, I'm only giving you a dot point today, but that has to be, there's no doubt about it, it has to be addressed from birth and it has to be addressed as a whole. It's key, absolutely key. It's not the only factor, but it is absolutely key.
Do you have in mind any best practices cases in that something similar was?
Well, I'm hearing definitely aspects. I'm hearing programs that are trying to address those imbalances, such as gender-based violence, but also socio-economic and political circumstances. But it's a big call. I mean, it's microcredit programs are good, but they're not long-term sustainable. And so I think we have to look at it as a hard slog. You know, Anne Gallagher, the guru on human trafficking, would say there is no quick fix. We can't, you know, we have to. It's going to. She says that climate change and global warming will be addressed before the commodification of people will ever be addressed. That's pretty scary. It's pretty pessimistic. But I think if we keep challenging the structures rather than looking at symptoms, we've got a better hope of doing something.
I know it's not the main focus of this particular research study, but I want to know if you had experience, because seeing the other side of the coin, some testimonies of the traffickers themselves, I would like to know if you have had the opportunity to analyze this same issue, but on the trafficker's side, and if you would have any comments on that maybe some things overlap in experiences of childhood and any comments?
I haven't done that research myself, but I have met someone who is currently doing that research. I haven't got her name here. She's very interested in the sort of motivation behind trafficking, but of course there are all sorts of traffickers, and it's complex as well. You can have male traffickers, you can have traffickers who have been trafficked themselves. So it's a complex issue, and I guess one of the important things to note is that people who are being criminalised or found guilty of trafficking at this point in time are not necessarily the highest level. And so, you know, the worst experience for me was meeting a woman who has been given 20 years prison for being a trafficker, who herself was trafficked because she was so-called, you know, she was called that she was pimping. And I know her personally. And so there's a whole area of research, I think, that needs to go into looking at that whole aspect of trafficking. Absolutely. Yes. 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 Absolutely, and so that's why in childhood, basically, you know, I've looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I've looked at all the different. I've looked at different approaches, and so of course these ones that are right in front of you now, they're definitely hierarchical, because the last optimal life course condition in adulthood is community. Let me have a look. One of them is community cohesion, and yes, that's a really important part. But I'm not going to put it in, you know, as one of the first, because a person needs to have established an adequate standard of living. The basic human needs need to be met before anything else. So definitely it's a hierarchy, yeah. And also, like, these things cross over, like it's... yes, I saw a couple of other hands. Yeah, thanks.
Maybe not perfect, but because all of these programs, it's pretty obvious they should help, right? All cost money, cost program, cost government intervention, cost good civil society, price good civil society. So how do you actually begin a program in a community like a town or a countryside in Philippines? And then who's working on this? What has been done locally and globally
Okay.
to, I'm looking for what has been done, what has been effective, and what we as individuals can do to help.
Yeah, I don't want to leave you feeling all doom and gloom. There is hope. There are plenty of programs happening throughout many different countries. I suppose at the global level, which is where I'm currently based at the United Nations, I'm trying to shift, which is what I've been talking about today, is to shift the narrative. Because if at global level we keep talking about trafficking as a random event, we've got to catch the big bad wolf, countries will never make the decision and look at the root causes. So we fundamentally have to go back to the root causes. But in communities, for example in Cebu in the Philippines, the Good Shepherd Sisters, and there are a lot of religious congregations who are doing lots of work around the issue of trafficking, are working closely with the local government around child safety, child protection, and addressing some of these basic preventative needs. I mean, we'll never see the results we won't see the results for a long time. But if you were to adopt these optimal life course conditions, not only would you eradicate human trafficking, but you would eradicate a number of other social issues. So in that sense, it is idealistic, but we need to go for it. And there are, I can't offhand think of particular programs other than those that I've visited in Cambodia, in Thailand, in the Philippines, whereby there are real grassroots programs happening to assist women, particularly in education and around the issue of gendered violence. Thanks for the question. Yes?
So first of all, thank you for your kind of a theoretical question. Prostitution and color school city. Well, she's a sex worker.
Mm-hmm.
Then the other city, she's a prostitute, she's a criminal.
Mm-hmm.
While another would say,
Yes. What's my... So throughout the thesis I do try to address this question, although one of the things I am saying is that a big debate that has been part of the trafficking debate has been this issue of prostitution and sex worker right advocacies. And I agree it's an important debate. But if we just get entrenched ideologically in the debate, we're never going to move forward on the basics here. Now, some, as you said, there are some who would claim that trafficking and prostitution are the same thing. There are some who say until prostitution is abolished, then human trafficking for sexual exploitation will never end. There are others who say, well, a woman has a right to freely choose to prostitute herself if she wants to. They see it as a form of sexual autonomy. My understanding is, in my research, I was asking what the experience was. And I still go back to that, who offers the source of information? And it's those who experience it. And predominantly, the women that I've spoken to personally, many of those who I've encountered, those who I've read, see prostitution as violence against women. And I often say, if you had a triangle, at the very top of the triangle, you might have what I call high-class call girls who voluntarily choose to be in the sex industry. You can't deny that they exist. But if you look at the triangle, predominantly those who are prostituted and trafficked for sexual exploitation sit right, are at the bottom of the triangle. They're the most marginalised. But it's controversial. There's no doubt about it. But I keep saying, go back to the source, those who experience it. Yes?
thank you so much for your information. I come from the other side. So I found it interesting. other side of the world where but it is able to be expanded to reflect what happens with other girls. I'm a former high school teacher, and so many of these sorts of things I see and I've discussed with my students as things that made them vulnerable as a result of their childhood experiences that lead them to make specific life dropping out of school,
Right.
To work, and then led into other sorts of things, or why you don't come to school in the first place, lack of funds. And so those sorts of things, the commonalities were very, very jarring, because this is another side of the world, still the same sort of structural differences.
Thank you. It's a really good point. And you know, I was on a panel recently with an American girl who had been trafficked, because some people were saying to me, "Oh, you're talking about the Philippines. You're talking about third world countries. It's different. The vulnerabilities are very similar. So the vulnerabilities of American girls who are being trafficked, the backgrounds, often sexual abuse, runaways, lack of education." All those vulnerabilities appear to be becoming universally expressed by those who experience trafficking. And so that's why when I talk about my research as phenomenological, is that yes, it does often reflect the experience of others. I could take one more question, I think, and I'd like to take yours.
I work for the Indiana Trafficking Victims. Here in Indiana, we see part of the thing that we face in the United States, at least from my experience, is that people aren't even aware that it's a problem, and so that's another obstacle that we just have to educate the community that.
Yes. Yes.
The other thing is that in 91% of victims know their trafficker in the United States. So have you thought about, or my question is, obviously there's a need to focus on these optimal life force conditions, but then a lot of our kids in India are trafficked by their parents, and so how does that play into your...
It's a good question. I think there has to be several things done. So, of course, we have to react and respond to those that have already been trafficked. There needs to be aftercare, there needs to be things put in place like that. But it's precisely issues like the family, lack of support, or the family that is the trafficker, that I'm saying we need to ensure at the basic level, and even in a country as wealthy as the United States and Australia, there are still children being brought up who are being abused in families and so on. So we need to go to that preventative model. But I absolutely agree, we need to be doing there are many aspects to it. We have tended to be reactionary in relation to human trafficking, and so my particular research is calling for a more holistic preventative model, but I absolutely agree.